A flight attendant tried to yank a toddler's seatbelt in frustration, but the sleeping man in 7A woke up, and no one realized he was a CIA interrogation expert until the cabin fell silent. He wrapped a seatbelt around a toddler's neck, certain the sleeping passenger in 7A wouldn't notice. He didn't know that man was the child's father, and one of the CIA's most feared interrogation experts subscribe. If you believe real danger isn't loud, it opens its eyes quietly. The sound of the seatbelt buckle being tested didn't ring out, it whispered. Barely audible above the cabin's soft, recycled hum, it should have gone unnoticed, but Dalen Marr's fingers lingered too long. He was crouched by seat 7B, his Navy uniform crisp, his expression unreadable beneath a mask of professionalism, eyes sharp and calculating as they hovered on the toddler now asleep in the window seat. His name was Naren. He couldn't have been older than 2. A slight weight beneath a fleece blanket, soft curls brushing his brow as he breathed in delicate, rhythmic sighs. He clutched a small plush rabbit in one hand, its ear mashed under his palm. Harmless, innocent, easy to overlook, except Dalen hadn't. He reached forward slowly, the motion disguised under the pretense of checking the oxygen mask panel above the row. Passengers around him paid no attention. A woman across the aisle flipped through a magazine. A man near the emergency exit typed lazily on a tablet, all of them unaware that Dalen's gloved hand now brushed the seatbelt strap near the toddler's stomach, then tested the tension, then flicked the release. The belt loosened. The child shifted only slightly, lips parting in a sigh. Dalen stayed crouched, his back straightened unnaturally like a man forcing himself to stay composed. A sliver of sweat traced down the side of his temple, though the cabin air was cool. "Routine seatbelt check," Dalen muttered under his breath, a line meant for no one in particular. His voice held no warmth, no real concern. He didn't look at the oxygen panel again. His attention stayed fixed on the boy, but more importantly, on the man across the aisle, seat 7. Aryan Vale sat slumped slightly to one side, his chin tilted down, hands folded loosely in his lap. He wore an olive-gray zip jacket over a collared shirt and didn't appear threatening in the least. His breathing was slow, eyes closed, unmoving. To most, he looked like another weary traveler. To Dalen, it meant opportunity. But the truth Aryan wore wasn't in his clothes, it was in his stillness. A stillness honed in cells without clocks, across metal tables smeared with secrets. He was not asleep. Not entirely, not the way others slept. He rested the way men trained in interrogation and counter-control rested, with their subconscious on a hair trigger and their body in ready stillness. Yet, to the outside world, he was a father, dozing while his child slept peacefully across the aisle. Harmless, or so it seemed. Dalen's eyes lingered on him longer than needed, studying, testing, almost daring. He looked back at the child. The seatbelt lay half loose, slack enough to allow movement. Dalen reached for it again, slowly curling it between his fingers like a cord, his lips pressed thin. Something burned in his gaze, a mix of ritual and detachment, like a man reenacting a moment he once imagined with far too much detail. "I was told to correct non-compliance," he whispered, "even this young." The words slipped past his lips before he realized he had spoken them aloud. They were meant for no one, but they revealed everything. Hidden behind his monotone professionalism was something unspoken, a fracture, a history. A soft beep echoed from a nearby seat as a passenger unlatched a tray table. No one looked his way. No one saw the way his hand slowly looped the belt over the toddler's shoulder. Not fast, not yet tightening, but positioning, as though testing the belt's length against the size of the boy's throat. Dalen's hand trembled once, then stilled. Across the aisle, Aryan's head shifted the slightest degree. His eyelid twitched. Nothing dramatic, just the tiniest muscle recognition of imbalance in his peripheral space. He did not wake. Not yet, but something in his gut registered a shift, a vibration, a breath out of rhythm, a wrongness, the kind he'd been trained to feel years ago in interrogation rooms when lies took shape in silence. Dalen twisted the belt slightly, now tightening it a second time, lightly, gently, but deliberately, in that cruel midpoint between threat and hesitation. His face showed no pleasure, just focus, calculation, as though he wasn't acting from rage or impulse but from rehearsed compulsion. The plane's lighting dimmed gradually as the crew prepared for the second half of the flight. A gentle orange hue bathed the aisle. Dalen's figure cast a long shadow beside Naren's seat. He checked again, no eyes watching him. Only the child's soft breath, now hitching slightly as the belt's pressure grazed too close to his neck. Still, no outcry, only the rising tension of unspoken danger. Across the aisle, Arian's hand flexed once in his sleep, his thumb curling inward as if responding to a silent alarm buried in muscle memory. And Dalen? He tightened the belt one more inch, not enough to leave a bruise, just enough to test the edge. The storm forming in silence was the kind no training manual could ever prepare for. Dalen Marr reached down in a quiet, calculated motion and disconnected the toddler's seatbelt with a soft, metallic click, the sound drowned beneath the low drone of the engines. His hand lingered an extra moment as if weighing the belt in his fingers, his movements deliberate, masked under the mechanical pretense of checking an overhead sensor. He didn't look rushed. In fact, his stillness was unsettling, methodical in a way that suggested he wasn't improvising. His pale gloves curled around the slack belt as if he were handling a living thing. The toddler, Naren, shifted only slightly in his sleep, his cheek resting against the blanket with a trusting calm. Only children possessed. A tiny breath fluttered from his lips. He had no idea a shadow was coiling beside him. Dalen's eyes twitched, not blinking, but adjusting. He glanced down the aisle. A man a few rows back briefly looked up from a crossword puzzle, his brows knit in vague confusion. But before concern could form into words, Dalen offered a polished, professional smile, tilting his head just enough to seem harmless. The man hesitated, nodded slightly in return, then went back to his puzzle. It worked. It always did. Dalen had mastered the art of appearing helpful, of being invisible in uniform. Kneeling once more, Dalen cradled the belt in his hands and twisted it slowly. Not tightly, not yet, just enough to feel the fibers resist, enough to imagine what it might feel like when drawn across skin. His eyes stayed locked on the belt, not the child. The obsession wasn't personal with the boy, it was symbolic. This wasn't about Naren, not really. This was about control, about proving something to someone or perhaps to no one but himself. He whispered something under his breath, barely audible even to his own ears. "Correction," he murmured. "Compliance." The words came like a code remembered from a dream, or maybe from a briefing given in a room no one spoke of. His voice carried no emotion, but his posture betrayed something else. Restrained fury, disappointment, a compulsion rooted deeper than training. Behind him, the rest of the cabin floated in a lull of soft lights and low chatter. A steward handed someone a water bottle near the exit row. Two children played quietly with headphones near the back. No one noticed what was happening just beneath their gaze. Dalen's left hand slipped behind Naren's headrest as he carefully looped the belt around the boy's neck. Not yanked, not pulled, just looped softly, with an almost reverent touch. His eyes narrowed as the belt settled, and he watched for movement, for resistance, for anything that might signal he was seen. Naren stirred faintly, a small hand twitching beneath his blanket. His lips moved but made no sound. The belt made contact with the soft curve beneath his jaw, grazing the tender skin with a cold brush of synthetic fabric. Dalen hesitated. Not from guilt, but calculation. 1 inch too far, and someone might notice. 1 inch too little, and the assessment might fail. He swallowed once, then tightened. Slow, steady, as though winding a clock. Still asleep in 7A, Arian Vale's body shifted. Just slightly. Not in wakefulness, but something closer to instinct. A flicker of breath change. A minute twitch of his fingers. Somewhere in the recesses of his subconscious, his training, years of it, buried under layers of calm, registered imbalance, subtle environmental irregularities, unspoken cues of threat. But the conscious mind hadn't surfaced yet. Not fully. Dalen's right eye twitched. He felt it. The tension of risk, the danger of detection. But it didn't stop him. He moved with the confidence of a man operating under assumed permission or twisted purpose. He studied the toddler's slow breathing, adjusting the belt by millimeters, tightening it in careful degrees. His expression was unreadable, but behind his stillness was something brittle and dangerous. Across the aisle, the man with the crossword, Rovin Keld, looked up again. This time, a crease formed between his brows. Something didn't feel right. He leaned slightly in his seat, peering at the row where Dalen knelt. He saw the belt in Dalen's hand. The child's neck tilted too far to one side. His mouth opened. Before he could speak, Dalen stood, fluidly, and reached above the seat as if adjusting the reading light. His body blocked the view just long enough to break the moment. "Just a minor buckle issue," he said with a friendly nod, though his voice was strained. "All under control." Rovin froze. The words made sense. The tone didn't. But before he could challenge it, Dalen turned back to the boy and knelt again. Naren's breath hitched. A soft, fragile sound escaped his throat, barely a gasp. Dalen froze, his hands suspended in midair. He watched the boy's lips part, then close again, another inch. Another silent test. The cabin lights dimmed slightly again as the plane adjusted altitude, plunging the aisle into a warmer, twilight hue. Dalen glanced at the emergency lights as if double-checking that they wouldn't flicker on. That no camera would catch this. His fingers hovered near the belt again. Behind him, Arian Vale's breathing had shifted, not noticeable to a bystander, but inside the storm of his neural pathways, red flags were tripping. Pattern. Recognition was activating. Danger was circling him like a fog, even if his eyes remained closed. Dalen leaned closer, his whisper now softer, as if speaking to himself, not the boy. "Just a little longer," he said. "Just enough for data." He tightened again. Naren's fingers flexed. His shoulders jerked faintly. And yet Dalen didn't stop. His movements grew slower, more committed, like a man stepping deeper into a moral quicksand he no longer cared to escape. This was no accident, no moment of poor judgment. This was rehearsed, refined, repeated. The nearby passengers remained blind, their headphones in, their drinks half-sipped. The moment passed beneath their notice like a tremor underfoot. Dalen adjusted his grip, twisting the belt slightly to lock it in place without fully closing the loop. His eyes gleamed with something unspoken. The cabin's quiet air trembled with a danger nobody had yet seen. The cold edge of the seatbelt brushed against Naren's soft cheek like a thread of ice. His small body shifted slightly, a faint squirm beneath the blanket as sleep broke just enough for discomfort to register. Dalen froze mid-motion. His gloved hand, wrapped tightly around the belt, hovered in place as his eyes flicked to the boy's face. The child's lips parted slightly, breath catching in a shallow whisper of unease, but his eyelids didn't lift. Still asleep, barely. Dalen's jaw clenched. He could pull back now, let go, blame it on a systems check, say the belt was loose and he was securing it, but something in his mind refused the retreat. His lips tightened, eyes narrowing with that same expression he wore earlier when he spotted Naren alone for those brief moments. Whatever twisted logic pulsed behind his eyes, it only pushed him further. With quiet force, he tightened the belt by another inch, slow and deliberate, just enough to limit movement without leaving an obvious mark. The practiced ease in his hand suggested this wasn't the first time he had rehearsed something like this. The cabin's soft blue lights cast gentle shadows along the seats. From a few rows behind, nothing seemed unusual. A flight attendant adjusting something. Routine, invisible. Only one man, Rovan Keld, seated a row diagonally behind the Toddler, noticed something wrong. His magazine dipped slightly as he saw Naren's head tilt in an unnatural angle, the line of his neck bending oddly under the belt's strain, his eyebrows furrowed. Before he could speak, Dalen rose and leaned forward, feigning an adjustment of the overhead reading light, his body conveniently eclipsing the child from view. "Just making sure the panel's secured," Dalen murmured to no one in particular, his voice low and hollow. Meanwhile, across the aisle, Arian Vale remained reclined, head slightly tilted, arms folded neatly. To any observer, he appeared sound asleep, relaxed, unmoving. But something shifted. Deep inside the well-trained instincts of a man who had woken in war zones and interrogation rooms, a sliver of awareness stirred. His fingers twitched lightly on the armrest. His breathing shifted, becoming fractionally sharper, as though a thread of unease had found its way into the weave of his rest. In his subconscious, Arian's senses parsed the cabin. The slight shift in vibration near row 7B, the strain in human breath patterns just beyond the boundary of silence. He remained motionless, but his mind, honed through decades of reading body language, lies, and danger, was circling something. Not yet awake, but no longer resting. Back at the aisle, Dalen leaned in again. This time his expression was different, no longer hiding behind the facade of professionalism. There was focus now. A bitter kind of resolve. His gloved hands moved slower, twisting the belt one more notch around the small body beneath him. He was methodical, unhurried, like a man following through on a rule no one else could see. Naren's chest rose irregularly, a faint hitch interrupting the rhythm of a toddler's breath. His face tightened in discomfort, a small sound escaping, a broken whisper no louder than the ambient hum of the aircraft. It was a sound no one noticed. No one, except the man who trained his body to detect stress responses even in sleep. Arian's head twitched. His eyelids fluttered once before locking open, fully alert. His pupils adjusted instantly to the dim light. But he didn't sit up. Not yet. He listened to that sound again, the kind of sound he had once trained interrogators to recognize as a silent call for help. His body stayed still, but every nerve inside had already mapped the room. Across the aisle, hidden by Dalen's deliberate positioning, Naren's breathing struggled under the subtle tension around his throat. No words, no cries, just a fragile hiccup of breath. Dalen, unknowing, continued twisting. Rovan glanced again but saw only Dalen's back. He hesitated, unsure whether to stand, but something in him warned not to escalate too quickly. Instead, he folded his magazine and kept his eyes narrowed, readying himself without knowing why. On the floor, the edge of Dalen's shoe tapped rhythmically, unconsciously timed to his internal pressure. The belt, now tightened with unnatural precision, had become a tool, a lever of control cloaked beneath routine. And still, Arian didn't move. He watched now, eyes nearly closed again, but his perception sharpened to a blade. He tracked the way the belt was angled, the slight quiver in Naren's leg, the shadow movement of Dalen's arm, every piece assembled like a threat profile, exact, emotionless, deadly. He waited for the trigger. Then it came. Naren's breath caught again. Not a cry, not a shout, just a soft, stifled gasp, a thin, injured sound that sliced through the thick quiet of the cabin like the whisper of glass cracking under pressure. Dalen didn't flinch. He was too far gone. But Arian moved, not with panic, not with violence, with the chilling calm of a man who had broken lies out of the unbreakable. He rose with absolute silence, his feet gliding against the carpeted floor like a shadow-shifting form. His steps were precise, no wasted motion, no alarm, just a silent calculation walking toward the exact epicenter of danger. The gap between his seat and Naren's row closed in seconds. He crossed the aisle with the balance of someone trained to draw weapons without sound, to read posture before intention. He said nothing. Dalen hadn't even noticed the shift behind him. Arian watched, now only a step away. His son's chest moved irregularly, the belt pressed gently into his skin, the forced loop drawn unnaturally close around his collar. And still, Dalen's hand adjusted it further. In Arian's mind, the variables aligned instantly: distance, grip strength, wrist angle, pressure points. The calculations snapped into place like switches on a board. His body lowered into a stance of controlled readiness, fingers curling without tension. The belt shifted again. That was the last inch Dalen would get. The fragile line between sleep and fury thinned with every tightening inch. Just as Dalen prepared to tighten the belt further around the boy's neck, a faint, broken gasp escaped from Naren's lips. It was small, barely more than the whimper of disturbed sleep, but it cut through the cabin's quiet like a wire pulled too tight. The sound carried, thin and sharp, and it reached something in Arian Vale that no one could see, something buried deep, trained and honed over years. In the span of a breath, his body responded before his conscious mind did. His eyes snapped open, sharp and focused, not dazed or confused like someone waking from rest. They scanned not for light, not for movement, but for danger. And there it was. The moment his gaze landed on Naren, his son's tiny frame curled slightly, the angle of his neck subtly wrong, the glint of metal looped too high on the chest, Arian's world narrowed into three things: the belt, the threat, the distance. Dalen Marr had no idea that he had just made the gravest mistake of his life. He was crouched forward, back turned, knuckles white on the seatbelt as he slowly twisted it tighter with mechanical focus. To anyone else, it might have looked like an awkward adjustment. To Arian, it was a calculated act of harm. Without sound, Arian rose. There was no rush in his motion. Every part of him moved as if pre-programmed, a fluid, silent sequence executed by instinct. His spine straightened with military precision. His feet landed without weight. His hands moved not with panic, but with purpose. In the quiet blue hue of the cabin's evening lights, he seemed more shadow than man, an echo of stillness wrapped in readiness. But within him, fury gathered. Not wild, not loud, just focused, controlled. The kind of fury that ends things. 3 steps. That's all it took to reach the aisle. He didn't blink. Dalen was still bent over Naren, eyes on the buckle, adjusting and retightening with a strange kind of reverence. He muttered something under his breath, inaudible nonsense that passed as justification in his broken logic. His fingertips grazed the belt's edge again, preparing for another loop, another cruel inch of pressure. Arian's hand clamped around Dalen's wrist with surgical precision. There was no warning, no threat, just sudden stillness, a force that froze Dalen's entire body. Pain surged through his arm as Arian pressed into a nerve point below the elbow, a technique that bypassed muscle strength entirely. Dalen gasped, jerking up in surprise, and finally saw the man standing over him. But he didn't see just a father. He saw eyes that had watched enemies break in rooms without windows. "Let go," Arian said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried authority, the kind that came not from shouting, but from finality. Dalen dropped the belt instantly, hand recoiling as if it had been burned. He stumbled back, trying to find footing, his breath loud now in the hush of the cabin, but Arian stepped forward, between the seats, between the threat and his son. His presence filled the narrow space like a rising tide, calm, inescapable, inevitable. Passengers in nearby rows turned slightly, curious at first, then uneasy. Something in the air had changed. The man who had been sleeping minutes ago now radiated something colder than anger, something trained. Dalen held up both palms. "It was a misunderstanding," he stammered, trying to conjure the mask of professionalism. "I thought the belt—" He was squirming. "Don't lie," Arian said, eyes never blinking. Dalen's mouth stayed open, but no words came. He looked around, seeking support, but none came. The passengers saw the way Arian stood, shoulders squared, feet balanced, breath even, and understood instinctively that this man was not reacting out of panic. He was executing a decision. Arian knelt by Naren, gently lifting the belt from around his small neck. The child whimpered softly but did not cry. His father's touch, steady, warm, familiar, restored the quiet in him. Arian inspected the faint red imprint on the skin, jaw tightening. His fingers brushed through Naren's hair as he whispered something only the boy could hear. Then he stood again, not looking at Dalen. "Get up," he said. "Step back." Dalen obeyed, unable to disguise the shake in his knees. Arian pointed to the jump seat near the galley. "Sit there. Keep your hands on your thighs. You move again, speak again, and I will treat you as I would any trained hostile." Dalen stumbled into the seat. His posture collapsed the moment he sat, shoulders folded inwards. Sweat glistened on his temple. For the first time, he looked like what he truly was, a man who had stepped into something far beyond his comprehension. Back in 7A, Naren's breathing settled. Arian returned to his side and fastened the child's blanket with care. All the while, his thoughts raced, not with panic, but with questions. What made Dalen do this? Was it a breakdown? Was it personal? Or was it something else entirely? Something planned? The belt rested in Arian's hand now, no longer a tool of control, but a piece of evidence. And the man in 7A, no longer sleeping, was awake in every sense of the word. The moment Arian stood, the balance of power on Flight 712 shifted forever. Arian's hand clamped down on Dalen's wrist like a silent trigger snapping shut. The moment was surgical, precise, swift, final. His fingers locked around a pressure point just below the thumb, sending a paralyzing jolt up Dalen's arm that caused the belt to fall from his grip like a dead snake. Dalen gasped sharply, his body recoiling in reflex, unaware that the storm he had summoned had already wrapped around him. Whirling around, his startled eyes met Arian's, and instantly, the color drained from his face. Arian didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stare alone dismantled any illusion Dalen had of control. It wasn't rage that filled his eyes. It was calculation. A frightening stillness, the kind found in men who had been trained not to react, but to resolve. His jaw was locked in perfect symmetry, his breath unbroken, and his posture straight but unthreatening, like a lion who hadn't moved yet because it didn't need to. Dalen stumbled backward, nearly colliding with a nearby seat, his hands flailing for something to hold onto that wasn't there. But Arian stepped forward, measured, calm, positioning his body between Dalen and his son like a shield made of silence and resolve. Naren, his tiny form tucked in the seat with the belt still slack around his neck, whimpered softly, his wide eyes locked on his father, not yet understanding, but knowing that safety had just returned to his orbit. Passengers a few rows back looked up at the scuffle but mistook it for an ordinary disagreement. Arian kept his voice low, just loud enough for Dalen to hear, but laced with the weight of a man who had once extracted truth from murderers in windowless rooms. "You're going to explain this," he said, his voice steady as iron, "and every word better match what I just saw." Dalen tried to retreat into the comfort of uniformed authority. "Sir, passenger compliance protocols, misunderstanding, seatbelt safety," he stammered, each word flimsier than the last. But Arian didn't blink. "Protocols don't leave bruises around a child's neck," he replied coldly, inspecting the belt with meticulous focus. He ran his fingers along the strap, noting how it had been twisted, not accidentally, but deliberately, to distribute pressure in a way that restricted airflow without leaving immediate marks. That level of detail couldn't have come from clumsiness. Arian's thoughts raced. The positioning of the belt, the precise angle, the way Dalen had applied it. This wasn't an outburst. It was a tactic. But why? He turned back to Dalen, who was visibly trembling now, his throat bobbing with a dry swallow. "You weren't trying to restrain him," Arian said slowly. "You were testing something. Who taught you that knot?" It was just instinct. I didn't. He moved suddenly, I thought. "Children don't resist when they're asleep," Arian cut in, voice flat. "And you weren't bracing for movement. You were bracing for silence." A beat passed, then another. In the soft cabin glow, Arian reached into the overhead compartment, retrieving a small medical kit. He opened it, pulled out a soft antiseptic wipe, and gently leaned down to wipe the slight redness from Naren's skin. Every movement was calm, controlled, as if cataloging evidence while cradling his son's safety in the same breath. The cabin noise dulled in his mind, narrowed to one task, securing Naren, dismantling Dalen. He turned back to face the man who had nearly crossed the line. "No man should. I'm not a flight risk," Arian said quietly. "But if you ever touch my son again, I'll make sure every agency that trained me knows your name." The words landed like a whisper of thunder, and Dalen collapsed back into a seated crouch as though his spine had turned to water. Arian stared at him for another long second, then turned away, not because the moment had ended, but because the next phase had just begun. He stepped once more toward Naren, who now reached up with tiny hands, fingers brushing the edge of his father's jacket. Arian gently pulled the child into his arms, cradling him with one arm while the other retrieved the fallen belt. He held it at eye level, analyzing its bends, the points of friction, and the faint heat left behind. This was no random act. Behind him, Dalen remained frozen. His chest rose and fell erratically, his mouth half open in stunned silence. He tried to speak, but words failed him, each syllable crumbling before reaching air. Arian's eyes returned once to Dalen's face, cold and unreadable. "You picked the wrong seat, the wrong child, the wrong man." And then, with methodical calm, he turned back toward the cabin, placing himself between every threat and the boy who now clung to his chest with quiet, childlike trust. The threat had tried to strike quietly, but it had awakened the wrong man. Arian's hand caught Dalen's wrist just as the man twisted to retreat, the sudden grip precise and unrelenting. The cabin hadn't caught up to what was happening yet. Passengers were still whispering, some standing for the lavatory, others lost in half-watched movies. But inside the narrow galley, the air had shifted. Dalen's eyes darted toward the cockpit, calculating, panicked, but Arian leaned in, his voice low and cutting through the man's frantic thoughts like a scalpel. "Step back, now." Dalen flinched. His feet obeyed before his brain did, shuffling awkwardly to the side under the weight of Arian's presence. The lighting in the galley flickered briefly, then steadied, casting both men in a sterile white glow that made Dalen's sweat stand out in sharp relief along his temple. Arian nudged the galley curtain halfway closed, not enough to alarm the cabin, but enough to make this space its own. Arian didn't bark commands. He didn't need to. His presence alone rewrote the rules of this confrontation. "You think you were correcting behavior?" he asked. Dalen's mouth opened, then shut. His shoulders twitched. His name badge had come loose, tilted askew on his chest, and he adjusted it as if that could rebuild the authority crumbling around him. I didn't mean to," Dalen mumbled, voice cracking. I thought it was part of the response threshold calibration." Arian tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "Response threshold. Say that again." "I was just," Dalen faltered, leaning back against the galley wall as if it might offer him protection. They briefed me to identify behavioral misalignment, test reactions under discomfort, only temporary, mild correctional measures. And by they, you mean? Dalen hesitated. A long breath wheezed from his lungs. Supervisor Vase. Karen Weiss. He called it the assessment phase. I was just supposed to monitor adjust. Just adjust. The words spilled out like they had been sitting too long under pressure. Unrefined, tangled, desperate. Arian noted every syllable, each pause between them, storing them like evidence. His gaze never wavered. "Why my son?" he asked. "I didn't know he was yours," Dalen replied quickly. "They said to target isolated minors' vulnerables, to test the limits of cabin discipline scenarios without intervention. It wasn't supposed to be like that. I lost control." "You didn't lose control," Arian replied coldly. "You followed an order that no decent man would obey." Dalen's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the jump seat with a dull thud, his head lowered, fingers twitching against his thighs. Arian crouched in front of him, not to comfort, but to examine. His training didn't just teach him how to detect lies. It taught him how to spot programming, subtle cues of conditioning. Dalen's gaze was too fogged, too rehearsed in his terminology. He was holding on to phrases like a man clinging to rails during a storm. "Vase gave you the script?" Arian asked. "Yes," Dalen whispered. "He said we were behind schedule. He said I needed to provoke something measurable, that it was the only way I'd be moved up. Moved up. Promoted for obedience, not merit." It was a familiar structure. Arian had seen it before in black site facilities overseas, programs that used words like adaptation and resilience to mask cruelty, and now it had made its way onto a commercial flight, on his son's seat. Footsteps approached down the aisle. Arian turned slightly, angling his body without ever removing his gaze from Dalen. Roven stood at the galley's edge, holding Naren, awake now, tear-streaked but safe. He looked smaller in Roven's arms than he had before, and Arian's jaw tightened at the sight. "He asked for you," Roven said softly, stepping forward and carefully transferring the boy into Arian's arms. "I didn't want to leave him alone." Arian took his son, pressing the child gently against his chest. Naren nestled in, instinctively wrapping a hand around the lapel of his father's coat. The silence thickened. Dalen didn't dare look up. Arian adjusted the child, never taking his attention off the man seated across from him. "You tried to run to the cockpit," he said flatly. "Why?" Dalen's lips trembled. "I thought maybe if I triggered the override code I could cancel the record. Vice said there was a backup server. If it recorded failure, I'd be removed." Arian's blood went cold. Removed, not reassigned, not reprimanded. Removed. "You think Vice is watching now?" Dalen nodded slowly. "Then good," Arian whispered, "because I want him to know that the assessment phase ends here." Dalen looked up, eyes wet and wide, the last layers of control slipping away. "What are you going to do to me?" Arian stood, the toddler now peacefully breathing against his shoulder, and stepped back. "Nothing more than what's necessary," he replied, signaling Roven, "but I suggest you start preparing for questions no one will help you answer." He turned toward the curtain, shifting it aside. Behind him, Dalen didn't move. He only whispered once, voice cracking like ice. "I thought it was just cabin stress." Arian didn't look back. The deeper Arian looked into Dalen's eyes, the more he saw a man unraveling from something far beyond cabin stress. Arian locked the restraint over Dalen's chest with a sharp snap of the belt, his hand pressing down with the kind of finality that didn't leave room for argument. The trembling man flinched but didn't resist, his limbs too loose, his breath too fast, like someone being dragged back from the edge of a breakdown. The narrow jump seat creaked under the pressure as Dalen tried to shift, his knees jittering in tight circles, eyes darting around the cabin like a cornered animal. Arian's body language remained poised, Yet inside his mind, strategies were sprinting. Something about this wasn't right. This wasn't just cruelty. This wasn't just a man snapping. Something deeper was puppeteering Dalen's descent. From behind, soft whispers swirled through the rows like a ripple on water passengers had noticed. Not everything, but enough. The way Arian moved, the way he controlled the space, was not how ordinary travelers reacted. There was an edge to his calm, a sharpness that didn't match the stillness on his face. It was the precision, the swiftness, the authority. Civilians don't handle situations like that. Arian turned briefly, walking back to where his son now stirred with shallow breaths and glassy eyes. Naren's tiny arms reached out automatically, fingers grasping at the air for his father's presence. Arian knelt, resting a steadying hand on the boy's cheek, inspecting the faint reddish line across the neck, thin but present. Rage tried to climb his spine, but he crushed it down. This wasn't over. His son was alive, conscious. A single touch to Naren's curls, a low whisper of, "I'm here," and the child calmed just slightly, pressing his cheek into his father's shoulder before Arian stood again. Returning to the seat Dalen had occupied earlier, Arian crouched with exact precision, sliding a hand under the seat cushion. His fingers brushed something stiff, folded paper. He pulled it free. It was a maintenance checklist, but one corner was thick with handwriting, out of place among standard box-ticking forms. In a cramped, angled scrawl that didn't belong to any technician Arian had known were the words, "Behavioral Compliance Trial, Assessment Phase," and beneath it a grid of initials, numbers, and phrases so disjointed they had to be codes. This wasn't paperwork. This was a trail, a directive, or worse, a script. Arian folded the paper once, slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and turned back toward the restrained man. Dalen's face had changed again. He was rocking now, barely, but visibly. A slow, forward-backward motion like a man adrift inside his own thoughts. His lips moved before sound came, and when it did, it was a fragile, uneven whisper. "I failed the assessment." Arian's brows narrowed. He took one step closer, watching every shift in Dalen's expression. "What assessment?" he asked, voice low, nearly a whisper so that passengers wouldn't hear, but every word landed like a pin dropped on glass. I tried. I followed the tension points. Passenger separation. Child response cues. But..." Dalen shook his head, the sweat now breaking in small beads across his temple. He wasn't supposed to move. He looked like he was alone. I thought he was a compliant subject. They said it had to look natural. Arian remained still. His heart had hardened into ice. This wasn't a man lashing out. This was a man reciting from somewhere he had been, somewhere broken, reprogrammed. The language he used was too clinical, too specific, too rehearsed. A stress trial, response cues. None of these belonged in a flight attendant's vocabulary. "You're not talking about protocol," Arian said quietly. "You're talking about instructions." Dalen blinked as if the words took a moment to land. Then a tremor passed through his lips. "They said, if I got a compliant passenger to obey under quiet duress, I'd move forward in the phase I didn't think your kid, I didn't know he was yours." Silence stretched. Just behind Arian, a teenage boy leaned out of his seat with curiosity, but a glance from Arian sent him straight back behind his tray table. "So, you were following orders," Arian said, the weight in his voice like an anchor. "But you don't even know who gave them to you." "I know," Dalen whispered, looking away, "but I'm not supposed to say his name." Arian leaned closer, and his eyes were sharper than they had been all flight. "Then say it anyway." For a moment, Dalen looked like he might break, but he only shook his head faster, squeezing his eyes shut as his hands began to curl around the edges of the jump seat, like a man clinging to a ledge. "They're watching the logs." He said they're always watching the logs. Arian stepped back, turning this new information over like a weapon in his mind. Logs meant surveillance. Surveillance meant data extraction. And if data was being extracted mid-flight, it meant the trial wasn't theoretical, it was live active. Which also meant the person who gave those orders could be on the ground right now, monitoring every reaction from a control point, waiting to see whether their puppet succeeded or failed. A behavioral compliance test involving real passengers, involving a child. No, this wasn't misconduct. This was design. Behind him, Naren gave a soft cry. Arian turned without hesitation and crossed to him, scooping him into his arms. The child clung to his shirt like a lifeline, burying his face in the cloth, and Arian could feel his tiny heartbeat pulsing rapidly beneath the surface. No child should have to process this. No father should have to witness it. Yet here they were, in the thin air above the world, caught in something twisted by procedure and ambition. Arian rocked his son gently, the cabin falling into an uneasy stillness. He watched Dalen out of the corner of his eye, watched the way the man mumbled to himself, rocking faster now, repeating words about assessment phases and failed trials and subject parameters. It was no longer a confession, it was unraveling. The checklist in his jacket pocket felt heavier now, like it carried more than ink, like it carried the weight of every passenger on board. He had to figure out who initiated this, who signed off on these trials, and, most importantly, how many more Dalen types were out there. Flying under the same illusion of purpose, his mission had changed. He wasn't just protecting his son anymore, he was unearthing a weapon buried inside a uniform, and he was the only one on board trained to dismantle it. The truth, forming in Arian's mind, was far colder than the act he had just stopped. He tightened the belt, whispering threats as the cabin dimmed, unaware the father's instincts had already awakened the moment his son's breath hitched. If you believe. Arrogance collapses, the second true training rises, hit subscribe now, because justice wakes up fast. Arian turned his head slightly and gave a sharp nod toward row 5. His eyes locked onto a man who had remained quiet for most of the flight, a calm-faced, middle-aged passenger with a clean-cut appearance and a quiet intensity in the way he watched things the man had been reading, but not absent-mindedly. Arian had noticed him earlier, observant, unassuming, not easily shaken. "Sir," Arian called lowly, his voice carrying with the kind of subtle command that made men pause mid-thought. "Would you mind sitting beside my son for a few minutes? Just keep an eye on him." The man blinked but stood without hesitation. "Of course," he replied, moving forward and gently settling next to Naren, who sat quietly now, his wide eyes still tracing his father's every movement like a compass needle to north. "What's your name?" Arian asked, hand briefly on the seat back. Joran Hale." Arian gave him a tight nod. "Stay near him. Don't let anyone approach." Joran's jaw tensed. "Understood." Without another word, Arian turned back toward the rear galley where Dalen Marr sat in the corner of the jump seat, his shoulders drawn tight, chin lowered like a child expecting punishment. The narrow lights along the aisle threw thin shadows across his pale face, which now shimmered faintly with sweat. Arian's steps were deliberate, but his thoughts raced in a practiced formation, lines of interrogation strategy layering over memory, sensory detail, and rising fury. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood directly in front of Dalen, holding the folded note between two fingers like an unexploded device. "I need you," Arian said softly, "to look at this." Dalen hesitated. His pupils twitched. He reached up slowly, but his fingers barely grazed the edge before he froze. Arian didn't blink. "Read the phrase." The man's lips parted. His eyes scanned the paper. His face dropped as though gravity had just doubled. "Where did you get that?" Dalen whispered, his voice catching. "You left it under your seat." Dalen choked slightly on the air. "That's not supposed to be. You weren't supposed to see that." "You believe you were part of this?" Arian asked, tone still calm. This trial. Dalen looked like a man caught between lies and memory. He nodded slowly. Supervisor Weiss. He said it was an assessment. Behavioral compliance passenger stress analysis. That it would help the company. Help the company, Arian repeated, gaze unflinching. And the instruction to target children, was that Weiss as well? Dalen's hand started to shake. He said test boundaries. Measure defiance under mild stress. Log responses. Nothing dangerous. Just observe. Apply pressure. But then, the belt. His voice cracked. I thought, if he cried, if I could document how long he resisted. Arian stepped closer. You wrapped a belt around a toddler's neck. I didn't mean. Dalen's voice rose in pitch. It wasn't. He said that if I failed again, I'd be grounded. I needed this flight to count. I needed to prove I could execute protocol. They're cutting people. He said they'd make an example of me. Arian's eyes narrowed. So, your fear of losing your job outweighed a child's life? No, Dalen hissed, then quickly lowered his voice. I didn't want to hurt him. I thought it was a test for me, too. I thought, maybe if I showed I could follow the hard rules, I'd get back on supervisor track. Arian's expression didn't change, but inside, a series of locked files opened in his mind. Cases from overseas, subjects in interrogation rooms, operatives fractured by psychological manipulation from handlers they trusted. Weiss wasn't just reckless. He was mimicking the conditioning frameworks used in high-risk intelligence programs. But here, it was corporate hidden under uniforms and flight numbers. And this time, the subject had not been a trained adult. It had been his child. Supervisor Karen Weiss gave you these orders? Arian asked flatly. Dalen nodded, slumping like a wire-cut marionette. Briefed me in the hangar before we boarded. Said it was Phase 1. Said kids were optimal subjects. Their reactions are clean, instinctive, not polluted by adult filters. He said if they resisted too long, that showed negative compliance, that I should intervene. And how were you supposed to record it? Arian asked. He said cabin footage was monitored. He said they'd pull it, review my performance. Dalen began to tremble again. He said if I didn't challenge someone, I'd be removed. They'd already marked me down last flight. This was my only shot. Arian closed his eyes for half a second, drawing in a breath like steel. His son had not been chosen by chance. He had been watched, measured. Left momentarily alone, he had become an opportunity for Weiss's grotesque metric of obedience. The mission had changed. This was no longer about restraining a rogue flight attendant. This was a systemic breach of ethics masquerading as innovation. A trial run, hidden above the clouds, conducted without consent or conscience. Dalen, Arian said, opening his eyes again, you've made choices you'll have to live with. But I need one more from you. When this plane lands, you will stay seated. You will speak to no one else. And if you think for even a second about covering this up, understand. His voice dropped to a quiet, clinical tone. I will make sure every word you've said is corroborated by every witness and every piece of evidence on this aircraft. You understand me? Dalen nodded. There was no fight left. Only collapse. Arian stepped back, tucking the coated paper into his inner coat pocket. The cabin was still humming in silence, oblivious to the unraveling layers of a hidden experiment. He walked back to Joran and gently ran a hand across Naren's head. The boy flinched, then relaxed under his father's touch. Joran leaned in. You all right? I will be, Arian said softly. But someone on the ground is about to learn what happens when you mistake a child for a test subject. He glanced down at the buckle still faintly imprinted across his son's neck, then toward the cockpit door, then to the overhead lights that glowed like false stars in a quiet sky. Karen Weiss was waiting at the terminal, probably reviewing data, probably confident that the trial had gone undetected, probably unaware that one of the passengers he labeled a stress vector had once led real interrogations in places Vase wouldn't survive a minute. Arian's next step was clear. He would land. He would walk off the plane. And he would make sure the man behind the curtain never ran another flight. Arian now understood that the seatbelt was only the beginning of a much larger betrayal hidden above the clouds. Dalen began to sob. The noise was quiet at first, more like air escaping than true weeping, but it clawed through the soft cabin hum and drew glances from the nearest passengers. His shoulders trembled as he sat restrained in the jump seat, eyes unfocused, mouth moving without clarity. "I did everything they asked," he whispered again and again, as if confessing to a ghost only he could see. Arian stood just 3 feet away, still and silent, his body angled between the man and his son. His right hand rested gently but protectively on the headrest of row 7, fingers curled just above Naren's sleeping spot, where Joran Hale now sat guard with a tension that hadn't left his posture since the moment Arian tasked him with watching the child. The descent had begun. A subtle tilt in the aircraft's pressure shifted the cabin floor under their feet. Seatbelt signs lit overhead. Engines eased into their final calibration. Flight 712 was beginning its approach into Vandrel Terminal, a facility cradled between high ranges and cloud-thickened dusk, but no one on board would remember the landing conditions. What mattered now hovered between the sharp focus of one man and the unraveling mind of another. Arian's gaze flicked to the folded paper he now held in his palm, the coded document he had retrieved from beneath Dalen's seat. Its contents weren't just scribbles. They were a script, a prompt, a hidden directive cloaked in logistics and jargon, but saturated with intent. Behavioral compliance trial, assessment phase, it read, followed by numbers, initials, and the kind of language that reeked of bureaucratic detachment, and yet someone had translated those abstract words into action. He looked back to Dalen. The man's sobs had twisted into small, desperate laughs, followed by hiccuped gasps of guilt. "They said it was training," he muttered. "Said we'd just observe. Just observe." "Who?" Arian asked. His voice was calm, but it carried the undertone of iron. Of years trained in extracting truth from silence, Dalen didn't respond. He shut his eyes, rocked slowly. "Told me kids were unpredictable, that they were good test variables." Arian stepped closer. "You weren't improvising. Someone instructed you." Dalen's lip trembled. His fingers clawed at his pant legs as if trying to stay grounded in reality. "They said it would help. Said I was helping." Arian knelt beside him, not with sympathy, but with forensic precision. "And when the child struggled to breathe," he asked, "did that still feel like helping?" The flight attendant broke completely. "I didn't want to hurt him," he choked out, "but the parameters, the directives, they said push until compliance." His voice dropped into a haunted whisper. "They didn't say what to do when it was a baby." Arian's jaw flexed. The fury had never left his eyes, but now something else entered. Clarity. This wasn't simply a man who'd lost control. This was a man conditioned, pressured, monitored, coerced under layers of corporate euphemism and psychological misdirection. And that changed everything. He stood again, eyes scanning the aisle. The passengers were watching now. Not overtly, some still pretended to read, others whispered behind raised hands, but the energy had changed. The cabin knew something deeper was wrong. They had seen enough to suspect, but not enough to understand. Arian leaned back against the galley wall, calculating. Every decision, every move, had to fit within the narrow frame between exposure and chaos. He had already neutralized the immediate threat, but to confront the machine behind it, to strike at whatever unseen authority had turned an airline attendant into a pawn, he needed leverage. Proof. Strategy. He unhooked the belt used in the assault, folded it carefully into a carry-safe loop, and tucked it under his arm. From Dalen's trembling form, he retrieved the notepad where scribbled observations had begun to track passenger reactions, in absurd clinical language. He flipped past rows of initials and saw it. 7B. Child. Minor agitation, non-compliance, escalation warranted. The bile rose in his throat, but he forced it down. He could not lose clarity now. Joran looked over, eyes asking questions. Arian gave a small nod. Naren stirred then, softly. He turned toward the aisle, his small face nestling against Joran's elbow. The marks around his neck were still faint, but visible. That image alone would outlive this flight in Arian's memory. His son, vulnerable in sleep, bearing the imprint of someone else's lesson plan. A soft ding sounded. The captain's voice announced final descent, but to Arian it might as well have been a signal flare. He stepped forward into the aisle, the belt, paper, and notepad in one arm, the mission in his mind now fully transformed. This wasn't about one man. This was about those who had watched, allowed, maybe even applauded from behind a terminal screen. Whoever they were, Arian would find them and expose them. He turned back once more, his eyes scanning the cabin, locking briefly on Dalen's bowed head. The truth, Arian muttered to himself, was never strapped into one seat, and with that, he pressed the call button to alert the ground team. They had requested a simple report of passenger disturbance. What they were about to receive was a classified briefing in plain clothes. As the wheels grazed the runway, passengers exhaled in relief. Arian Vale did not. His breath was measured, his spine straight, his grip firm. He bent down to pick up Naren from Joran's arms, holding him close. The boy stirred, blinked, and curled his fingers into his father's collar. Arian looked out the window toward the terminal. Beyond that glass wall was the man who issued the directive, and behind him, the machine that tried to measure obedience through fear. Arian's stride would be steady. His voice would be calm, but every step forward would be an indictment. He didn't need a badge. He had evidence, and he had the eyes of 1,000 people who had just seen something they would never forget. The descent of the plane mirrored the descent of everything hidden beneath the airline's perfect image. The landing gear touched the tarmac with a muted jolt. Arian Vale's eyes snapped forward as the subtle shudder of touchdown hummed through the cabin floor. He didn't exhale. He didn't flinch. He shifted. Still holding his son close against his chest, Arian scanned the cabin. The overhead lights brightened, revealing a plane full of passengers reaching for bags, unaware that something beneath their feet had already cracked wide open. The flight had officially ended, but the confrontation had not, and the real enemy was still waiting inside the walls of the terminal. Naren stirred in his arms, letting out a soft whimper. Arian adjusted his hold, brushing his thumb lightly across the boy's neck, feeling the faint impression left behind by the twisted belt. It was healing already, but the memory burned far deeper than the skin. He turned sharply to Joran Hale, the man from row 5 who had stepped up when needed. "Stay with him," Arian said, his voice low and commanding, motioning toward Dalen Marr, the restrained flight attendant now slouched in the jump seat with trembling limbs and sweat glistening at his temples. "Don't let him out of your sight until the agents arrive." Joran nodded, eyes steady despite the obvious tension clinging to his spine. "You have my word." Just then, the front cabin door hissed and unlocked. The mechanical groan of the jet bridge pressed in as it connected. 2 uniformed ground agents stepped into the entryway. One tall and broad-shouldered, the other lean and sharp-eyed, both held datapads in hand, scanning for the reported passenger disturbance. Arian moved before either man could speak. He stepped forward from the first-class section, slow and deliberate, cradling Naren like something holy, something sacred that had nearly been lost. The agent's expressions shifted the moment they saw him, not because of the child, not even because of the oddity of a civilian issuing silent commands with his posture alone, but because of the way he carried himself, like a man who'd spent years in places far colder than this, dismantling lies with his presence alone. "I'm not just a passenger," Arian said firmly. "I'm Federal Intelligence, Off-duty, but with full clearance for immediate engagement. My son was assaulted mid-flight by a crew member under the direction of someone inside your terminal. I'm invoking Code 72F. On-ground transfer of authority. I have evidence." The taller agent blinked, startled. The leaner one reacted faster, stepping forward with a sudden stillness, his demeanor shifting from routine protocol to sharp readiness. "You have confirmation?" he asked quietly, cautious but not doubtful. Arian extended a sealed plastic folder from his coat, revealing the seatbelt Dalen had twisted into a weapon, the folded paper containing the coded trial phrases, and 2 witness statements signed mid-flight. "I have confirmation, motive, and chain of command. The program goes by the name Behavioral Compliance Trial. The flight attendant was manipulated. The supervisor is expecting to cover it up. I'll need direct access to your operations room." The taller agent turned pale. This wasn't in the incident report." "Of course it wasn't," Arian replied coldly, "because the man you're about to escort off this plane submitted that report to hide what he did." As if summoned by the words, Dalen began to sob behind them. His voice cracked into the air like a wounded echo. "Don't send me back," he gasped, squirming against the restraint belt that held him to the seat. "Please, I didn't mean to. I followed the briefing. I did everything Vase said. Don't make me go back to the program." The cabin quieted around him. Even the disembarking passengers slowed, hesitant, confused by the sound of a grown man breaking apart beside a seated child and a figure in a black coat who looked nothing like an ordinary father. Arian didn't turn to look at Dalen. His jaw tightened. "This isn't revenge," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "This is containment." The agents moved to flank Dalen, securing his wrists gently but firmly, their professionalism strained by the unraveling man before them. Dalen didn't fight. He wept, stumbling down the aisle as if carrying his own sentence on his back. Arian watched in silence. He shifted Naren on his hip, gently pressing the boy's head to his shoulder. "It's over," he whispered, though he knew that wasn't true. This part was over. The damage had been stopped mid-air. But the mind behind it, the one who had turned an employee into an enforcer, who had looked at children and seen data points, that mind was still waiting beyond the gate. As the agents led Dalen away, Jorn returned to Arian's side. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" he asked. Arian nodded once. "I've done far worse alone." Then he stepped into the jet bridge. The tunnel was silent, artificial lights humming above. With each footstep, the air thickened, not with fear, but with precision. Behind the sliding glass doors of Terminal Control, Karen Weiss was likely sipping coffee, rehearsing excuses, possibly watching the cabin footage if he had secured access to it early. But Arian had more than footage. He had motive, he had evidence, and he had a child in his arms who would never be a test subject for anyone again. He paused at the end of the bridge just before the terminal threshold. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished glass. Behind him, fear, confusion, betrayal. Ahead of him, confrontation, revelation, truth. The child stirred slightly, and Arian tightened his grip, not out of fear, but out of resolve. The real interrogation hadn't begun yet. Arian stepped onto the jet bridge knowing the real interrogation was only beginning. Karen Weiss looked up from his tablet the moment the door opened with a soft hiss. His eyes, sharp and narrow, landed on the man stepping through, Arian Vale, with his toddler son, Naren, nestled calmly against his shoulder. Behind him, 2 ground agents flanked the doorway, their faces pale, unsure if they were escorting a father or something far more precise. Vase straightened in his chair, instinctively adjusting his collar, but the brief flicker of control dissolved the moment he noticed the faint red imprint circling the child's neck like a silent accusation. Arian said nothing at first. He walked forward with deliberate calm, placing Naren gently in a cushioned chair near the window before turning fully to face Weiss. The light overhead cast shadows across his face, but his eyes remained locked, focused not with rage, but with surgical intent. There was no flinch in his movement, no wasted breath. Vase opened his mouth to speak, but Arian cut him off before a single word escaped. "You knew something was going to happen," Arian said quietly, his voice smooth but razor-sharp. "You didn't just authorize that man. You planned it." Vase blinked, then slowly set the tablet down, feigning confusion. "Mr. Vale—" "Don't," Arian interrupted, taking another step forward. "You briefed him. I have the document. You told him to test disobedience responses, especially among children." There was a flicker, something behind Vase's eyes that gave him away, a twitch, too fast for most to catch, but not for someone trained to dismantle falsehoods. "That's not true," Vase replied, forcing a chuckle that landed hollow. "There must be some misunderstanding. I don't even—" Arian reached into his coat pocket and produced the folded maintenance checklist Dalen had tried to hide. He opened it slowly and laid it on the table between them, pointing to the handwritten phrase near the bottom. "Behavioral compliance trial. Assessment phase." Arian read aloud, every word deliberate. "Your handwriting?" Vase leaned forward slightly but did not touch the page. "That doesn't mean what you think it means." "Then tell me what it means," Arian replied calmly, "because a flight attendant nearly choked my son with a seatbelt while whispering about corrections and obedience. And I've seen the effects of psychological conditioning before. This has all the hallmarks of a failed operation." Vase leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocking with artificial ease. "This isn't a war zone, Mr. Vale. It's a corporate environment. You're projecting." "I'm trained not to project," Arian said, voice steady. "I'm trained to extract. And right now, I'm extracting the truth from a man who seems very nervous that two agents are standing behind him without having said a word." The ground agents shifted, exchanging glances. One of them, the older of the two, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Mr. Weiss," he said slowly, "why did you request access to unmonitored cabin footage before this flight?" Weiss turned his head so fast the chair creaked. "What?" The agent nodded. "We checked the log while waiting for the internal report. You asked for manual override access on Cabin 7's feed. Only that section you claimed it was for internal audit review." Arian's eyes narrowed. "You were expecting an incident." Vase's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "It was a hypothetical," he stammered. "I never expected. But you planned for it." Arian stepped closer, his tone tightening. "You picked Dalen because he had prior write-ups, didn't you? Easy to manipulate, easy to discard." Sweat now lined Vase's forehead. His voice dropped to a mutter. "I was trying to demonstrate initiative, an adaptive trial protocol. It wasn't meant to escalate, it was about metrics, passenger control, compliance in unpredictable environments." "You tested a stress protocol on a child," Arian said, "my child." The silence in the room stretched like tensioned wire. Even Naren, seated behind Arian, sat still. Quietly tracing the stitching on the chair's armrest with his finger, Vase tried to recover, but his voice cracked. No one was hurt. Arian took out the seatbelt, the same one Dalen had twisted around Naren's neck. He placed it on the table without a word. A red fiber still clung to the inside edge. Vase's eyes locked on it, and the facade collapsed. He exhaled, long and broken. "They never check this deep," he said, almost to himself. "They weren't supposed to send someone like you." "No," Arian replied, "they weren't." The agents exchanged a quiet glance and stepped forward. "You're going to cooperate with the investigation," Arian continued. "You're going to explain every name on that internal memo, every sign-off, every manipulation. And if you lie again, I'll know." Vase said nothing. He simply nodded once, defeated. The older ground agent retrieved a portable recorder and activated it. "This conversation is now being documented under Internal Security Protocol Karen Weiss. Do you acknowledge that you authorized unauthorized passenger conditioning procedures under the name behavioral compliance trial. Vase, voice trembling, replied, "Yes." "And do you acknowledge that you handpicked a psychologically vulnerable employee to enact that trial on minors without parental consent or corporate disclosure?" "Yes." The agent looked toward Arian. "Anything else you'd like to add before we take him?" Arian turned to Naren, who looked up with wide but calm eyes. Then he looked back at Vase. "Only this," Arian said softly. "You buried your orders in protocol, but my son's neck bore the proof." He stepped away, lifting Naren gently into his arms. The truth Vase tried to bury now sat exposed under brighter lights than any boardroom could withstand. The investigators didn't knock. They swept in 3 men in dark vests, moved through the gate with quiet urgency, followed closely by 2 airport operations officials. Their badges were shown but barely read, protocol suspended by the gravity of the report they had received mid-air. The operations room had barely absorbed the landing report when Arian Vale stepped forward, his voice calm but unshakable. "You'll want to see this now." Inside a secured terminal lounge cordoned off by blue velvet ropes, Dalen Marr sat slumped in a corner chair, eyes wide, posture shrunk inward. He had just been cleared medically after a short sedative was administered to calm his spiraling breakdown. But now, stripped of authority and uniform, he looked like a shell of the man who'd once walked the cabin with hollow control. Arian stood nearby, Naren asleep in his lap, breathing slowly under a soft gray airport blanket. The belt, still imprinted faintly with his son's skin, rested folded on the table beside him like a coiled accusation. An investigator named Inspector Ryven Hale knelt next to Dalen and asked his first question. "Tell me everything you remember from before the flight." His voice was neutral, but his eyes didn't blink. Dalen's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Arian watched carefully, tracking each twitch in the man's hands, each flash of regret or restraint. Finally, Dalen exhaled hard and whispered, "I was told I had one final evaluation." His eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as if still trying to escape. "Supervisor Karen Vase, he said the test was simple. Observe a disobedient child. Trigger reactions. Report behavioral shifts." Arian didn't flinch, but inside his thoughts burned like shrapnel. "And if there were no disobedient children?" he asked coldly, voice steady but pointed Dalen's fingers dug into his knees. Then, simulate the condition. The room fell into a silence too thick to breathe through. The investigators looked at each other, one of them scribbled notes. Another tapped into a digital console, cross-referencing flight crew logs. Arian stood up with Naren still gently balanced on his shoulder and walked to the center of the room. His tone was controlled, the calm of a man used to extracting truth in the most hostile environments. "There's more," he said, holding up the folded checklist he'd retrieved. This document was under Dalen's seat, not standard issue. Coded phrases, scribbled directives, and this. He pointed to a line scrawled in red, "Behavioral Compliance Trial, Assessment Phase." The lead investigator leaned over to read it, then immediately barked an order. "Pull the digital logs from Vase's office, now. Anything marked under Assessment or Trial. I want timestamps, cabin footage access requests, internal memos, everything." Outside the glass walls, media vans rolled up. Reporters with wind-pulled hair leaned against camera rigs, sensing a scandal too big to ignore. The airline's upper management scrambled behind closed doors, their well-tailored panic hidden behind press releases claiming ongoing investigation and internal cooperation. But Arian already knew the truth. He had seen it in Vice's eyes the moment they met. The experiment had company approval, if not in writing, then in knowledge. Dalen began to cry softly. He said if I didn't follow through, I'd be flagged as unstable, reassigned to cleanup, maybe worse. He said this was my only chance. Arian approached him, calm as stone. You hurt a child. You tightened a belt around his throat. You were manipulated, but that doesn't erase the harm." His voice softened, just enough for Dalen to register the shift. "I accept your apology, not for what you did, but for what you allowed yourself to become." Dalen nodded, hands shaking. "I didn't want to fail. I thought this would be controlled." "You were wrong," Arian said. "Controlled is what I do. What you did was chaos disguised as instruction." Outside, a uniformed officer announced the arrival of Federal Agents Internal Affairs had been looped in. A subpoena had been issued for all experimental flight protocols over the past 18 months. The fallout had officially begun. The investigators regrouped, drawing up a timeline with Arian's precise surgical clarity. He gave them everything, minute-by-minute actions, the verbal slips, the coded patterns. His statements became the spine of the case, framing a narrative so clear that no corporate lawyer could twist it without snapping the truth in half. Later, as Vase was led down the hallway in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Arian one last time. There was no rage in the man's expression, only recognition. The game had ended the moment Arian stood up from seat 7A. The room had tilted against Vice before he even realized what passenger he'd boarded with. The media's questions blurred through glass. The terminal glowed with artificial light and quiet vengeance, and Naren slept, unaware of the war his father had just ended before it ever touched him again. The experiment built in shadows collapsed the moment it touched the wrong child. The gavel struck sharply. The sound cracked through the tribunal hall like a signal flare, silencing the low hum of whispers and tapping keys. All eyes turned to the central witness stand, where Arian Vale sat upright, hands folded with practiced stillness, as though carved from the same discipline that had shaped his career. He didn't need notes. He didn't need reminders. He carried every second of Flight 712 in his mind like a classified dossier, ordered, vivid, undeniable. And now, under oath and under scrutiny, he was prepared to detonate the truth. Mr. Vale, the lead tribunal judge, a silver-bearded man named Renford Carr, began with a formal nod. "You may proceed with your account of the incident." Arian's gaze swept the room. To his left, a row of tense airline executives adjusted their collars, sweat barely contained beneath tailored suits. Behind them, lawyers whispered strategies already failing. In the gallery, media lenses focused like rifles. But Arian's attention fell for a brief moment to his right, where Naren sat on a padded bench beside a court officer, tiny legs swinging, face calm, unbothered by the echo of trauma in the room. It was only the comfort of his father's presence that let him stay composed. That, and the subtle smile Arian offered before he spoke. "I woke up to a sound most wouldn't have heard," Arian began evenly. "But I'm not most people. I've spent 15 years being trained to detect distress through silence, to read danger through stillness. My son's breath changed, just slightly, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a seatbelt being pulled across his neck." Gasps rippled through the back of the chamber. A few pens paused mid-notepad. Arian did not flinch. "What I did next was instinct," he continued. "I neutralized the threat without raising panic in the cabin. I retrieved the belt, confirmed the source, and separated the individual, flight attendant Dalen Marr, from all passengers. I did not retaliate, I investigated." Judge Carr leaned forward, folding his hands. "What did your investigation reveal?" "That the act was not isolated," Arian replied. "Marr had been briefed by a superior, Supervisor Karen Weiss, to initiate what they called a behavioral compliance trial, a psychological test unapproved, unauthorized, dangerous." He reached into a folder beside him and withdrew the original coded sheet. Creased, but now mounted in evidence plastic, this was found under Marr's seat. It outlines experimental phases, targeting behavior of minor passengers under stress. My child became their data point. The lead airline counsel stood abruptly, Your Honor, objection. Overruled, Carr said without hesitation. Proceed, Mr. Vale. Arian's tone sharpened, not in volume but in precision. Vase created a false metric, passenger obedience under conditional stress, and gave instructions that, if followed, could have resulted in serious injury or worse. The trial had no ethical clearance, no institutional oversight, and it was administered mid-air. Murmurs surged again through the audience. Reporters scribbled frantically. An executive, 2 rows behind the defense, coughed hard, then slumped forward with a trembling hand over his face. The foundation was cracking. The judge looked toward the defense. Is there any rebuttal to these direct claims? None came. Arian took the silence as permission to deliver the finishing blow. The experiment was not only negligent, it was calculated. Vase attempted to delete portions of internal surveillance logs before landing. I retrieved physical evidence, secured multiple witnesses, and turned over all materials to federal investigators before this hearing. The tension reached its peak when Judge Carr looked to his fellow panel members, all 3 nodding grimly. This tribunal finds the airline and all involved parties in violation of both aviation safety protocols and child protection ethics. The behavioral compliance trial is to be dismantled effective immediately. A fine will be issued. Penalties will follow. Then Carr added, And Mr. Vale, your recommendation? Arian nodded, the next words already prepared. I propose the establishment of the Naren Guardian Initiative, a fully independent foundation funded by the airline as part of its settlement, dedicated to ensuring no child, infant, minor, or otherwise vulnerable passenger is ever subjected to experimentation, abuse, or untrained psychological pressure while flying. The proposal was met first with stunned silence, then slow applause from a row of civilian observers in the back. The judge smiled faintly. Motion approved. As the proceedings concluded, Arian stood slowly. With measured steps, he walked to Naren, gently lifting him from the bench. The boy curled naturally into his father's chest, fingers fisting lightly into Arian's jacket. Around them, cameras clicked. Executives avoided eye contact, but the man in the center didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had turned the courtroom into his interrogation room, without raising his voice, without drawing a weapon, without breaking a single law. And as the tribunal doors opened to the world beyond, his words echoed louder than any sentence passed that day. Justice rose from the quiet strength of a father who refused to let darkness wrap around his child. He thought he had control, and froze when the man from 7A stood silently, removed the belt in one move, and turned the attacker's own grip into evidence. If you believe no one harms a child without facing a master of truth, subscribe now, because justice doesn't warn, it intervenes. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, bias, and the moment true accountability confronts mistreatment. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every family with dignity and respect.